Well, Election Day is almost here, but before voters can make choices about who is on the ballot, they have to first be able to access the ballot and the polls. Obstacles like Senate Bill 90 and all the other new rules regulating polling places, exercising the right to vote, is becoming a real challenge. But the question is it by design, or are reforms needed to preserve the sacred activity which is at the core of our democracy? Joining me now to sort it all out is Dwight Bullard, Senior Political Advisor of Florida Rising, an organization dedicated to spreading political education to underserved communities. Thank you for joining me this morning, Dwight.
Happy to be here this morning, Juwan.
Well, this is just one of many discussions I hope that you and I have, especially before the election here in November, which is very important. So let's get right to it. Those underserved communities are the ones that seem to be targeted in the efforts to keep certain eligible voters on the sidelines. Why is that the case?
Well, let's be clear. You had an overwhelming number of black and brown folks that went out in 2020 in the midst of a pandemic and changed the outcome of major elections in places like Georgia, Detroit, Philadelphia. And so what we saw here in the state of Florida was the election in 2020 went to Donald Trump. In terms of the electoral votes for the state of Florida, Governor DeSantis said on that night that things went flawless. There were no problems. Yet we see bill after bill after bill coming out that specifically seems to be targeting minority voters or oftentimes historically marginalized voting populations here in the state of Florida.
So the question, what can South Floridians do in order to ensure that their votes are counted, whether they do it by mail, drop box, or at the polls?
Well, it's a combination of all of those, right? And I want to, make sure folks understand that voting is fundamental, voting is important, and you should not be swayed in any way, shape, or form to not engage in the electoral process. So early voting is going to be available. Election day voting is going to be available. Drop boxes are still available in many locations, thanks to our supervisor of elections here. And the vote by mail system works. The challenge that folks face is that if you did not reapply for vote by mail, you may not be receiving that ballot, right? And so there are concerns there for folks who may just sit at home with the expectation of receiving a ballot in their mailboxes who may not get it. And I just want to remind those folks, if you don't get it by a certain point, you should definitely still go to the polls and exercise your right to vote.
Well, Dwight, last month, more than a dozen people statewide were accused of election fraud for registering to vote with past convictions. Some of them even say that they were taken into custody in very dramatic fashion, with armed law enforcement officers by the dozens showing up in their homes early in the morning after they were ticketed or tricked into believing that they were eligible to vote. So what do you make of all of this? And then I mean, you see the showcase by the governor, and then come to find out it's not to take away from the fact that it's just a little bit more than a dozen, but you got to think, didn't more than 10 million people vote?
Correct. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not playing one on TV this morning, Joanne. What I will say is this looks, smells like entrapment, because at the end of the day, the state is responsible for determining who is eligible to vote. So these folks, all of those that were involved, got voter ID or voter information cards, went through the process in spite of their previous felony convictions. Many of them older gentlemen from again, historically marginalized communities. Mm-hmm. So I really do view this as design, meaning that for the overwhelming number of folks that are now eligible to vote because of the passage of Amendment 4 a few years ago, these individuals are now unfortunately being targeted by a system that is supposed to put fail-safes in place to make sure they're eligible to vote.
It's interesting because it looks like, and when you see, and I hate seeing this, but when you see mugshots on the screens, people that look like you and me,
right,
almost meant to be made an example of, almost as a scare tactic for some of those that won't, like now I don't even want to go vote. I'm scared. They may come in and they may try to do the same thing to me. And you see this. So my question to you is that when it comes to regulating, I mean, shouldn't that be with the supervisor of elections?
No, absolutely. And that is the point. So the idea of the Governor DeSantis grandstanding, exposing these folks you either have to ask the question, are you trying to allow more people to vote, or are you trying to make political points? And so when he goes and arrests these individuals, what you're basically doing is sending a message to those folks who are returning citizens that you should be extra careful not to go out and go too far as to vote. But we've seen, unfortunately, political posturing by this administration, more recently with the individuals from Venezuela that have been shipped out of state.
Oh,
right?
yeah,
So
that's
nothing new under the sun.
And that's another topic right there. So what can people do to make sure that they are legally registered to vote?
I would definitely encourage folks to check your status, right? Okay. You can still go to your local supervisor of elections website, simple birth date, name, making sure that you're good, making sure that if you think you've requested a vote by mail ballot, that you've actually gone on to make that request and double checking that request. But at the end of the day, have the proper ID, get out there and vote. Early voting here in Miami-Dade County is going to be 2 weeks prior to the actual election day. So folks really do have time to vet themselves and make sure that they're good, even if you are a returning citizen. And I definitely especially want to encourage those that have become eligible because of Amendment 4. Now's your time to shine. Get out there and vote.
I'm sure Desmond Meade will be very proud of you, by the way. And you were among the protesters who gathered outside of South Florida Courthouse where an appeal of recent SB 90 decision was filed. So tell us about that fight for voting rights and why is it that you decided to go out there and make sure that your voice was heard?
Well, yeah, we saw in our initial court hearing, Judge Walker in the Northern District basically saying that the state legislature and the administrations over the last 20 years have deliberately tried to exclude black voters by the nature of these, voter suppression laws that they've passed. Unfortunately, the governor won his appeal of that initial decision. So now we're appealing the governor, that most recent decision at the federal level. And what we're asking for is, again, an acknowledgement that what the governor said on election night, that the systems in Florida were sound, everything went as they were supposed to, then give people that same energy and stop trying to pass these suppression laws.
And your organization also fights for reproductive rights as well. So I'm interested in knowing your take on whether or not you believe that this election will drive some traditionally conservative voters to the left because of the reproductive rights issue.
I really do think that this is the bridge that has gone too far for a number of folks, because when you talk about not putting exceptions for rape or incest into some of these policies, the threat by this governor and his administration that he wants to push an all-out ban on abortion if he's re-elected back to office and gets a supermajority, should give every person who's sensible reason enough to go out and vote a different way. In November.
and my last question for you, brother, is and this is one that touches at my heart right here, because I've had so many debates on this over the course of my career as a journalist. What do you tell those people out there that are watching that their votes don't count, that always question whether or not their vote counts or not?
What I would simply say to those folks is that we have way too much of a legacy in this country of freedom fighters, whether they be suffragettes, whether they be civil rights icons, whether they be Latinx, whether they be LGBTQ+, who have all advocated that we have to show up and show out in order to make a difference. So the idea of sitting home just is implausible for me to contemplate. And so I'm encouraging anybody and everybody who has the energy, whether you're eligible or not, you can advocate within your family, within your community, that those who are eligible to vote, get out there and vote.
Get out there and vote. And with that, we'll leave it right there. Dwight Bullard, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Got it. For more information about rules, races, and dates to remember for the midterm election, log on to NBCnews.com/plan your vote.